And as we begin, I'd like to share the agenda for the webinar of today, and we will shut our cameras off in order to allow you to see the screen. Okay, today's webinar agenda is going to consist of 3 sessions. I will start off with the MedDRA 23.0 update session. This is going to be followed by a presentation by Dr. Sonia Brajovic, who is with the FDA. Her presentation is titled FAERS Update, COVID-19 and Pharmacovigilance Examples. This will be followed by a brief Q&A session, and this will allow attendees to ask any questions that they may have up to that point. We will conclude with an interactive coding exercises session. This will be conducted by my MSSO colleague, Dr. Amanda Saunders, and then we will end the webinar with another Q&A opportunity at the end. So the topics for today for my presentation are MedDRA 23.0 update. We'll also talk about briefly on an update we have on our points to consider documents, as well as touch upon the SNOMED CT and MedDRA mapping project. Also, we'll look at the MSSO trainings for this year, and we will conclude my session with a discussion on the MedDRA APIs or application program interfaces. So coming on to the MedDRA 23.0 update. It's important to note that this MedDRA 23.0 update was released on April 19th in both the English and Japanese translations. This version replaced the original MedDRA 23.0 release on March 1st. The ICH MedDRA Management Committee decided to update the March MedDRA 23.0 release in order to allow inclusion of COVID-19 related terms. This was an exceptional change to our standard release schedule, which is usually March 1st and September 1st. We felt this was necessary in order to ensure that any scientific and medical information from the COVID-19 outbreak could be captured and analyzed appropriately by the user community. Now, it's important to note that this release included all of the terms from the original MedDRA 23.0 release done in March, plus an approximately 70 new additional COVID-19 related terms, as well as revisions to a few terms. We had a few currency changes at LLT level. We also included a new HLT, coronavirus infections, and moved some existing terms a bit. All the other supported language translations were released by the end of April. Now it's time to hear from the audience already in the form of a poll question. It's very important for us to get some feedback from the user community. So if you will see a prompt to answer this poll question on your screen. Okay, so if you implemented the updated release, what was your experience? So choose A if you found the experience to be simple, B if you found it the same as a regular MedDRA update, or C if you found it to be difficult. And I think we'll give you a few seconds to answer that and see what the majority of you say. Okay, moving on. Let's go to the next slide. So in order to make it easier for users, we've dedicated a COVID-19 page solely for all information related to COVID-19. You can access this page by going to the meddra.org website. And from the top banners, you choose the How to Use button. From there, you choose Support Documentation, and that'll get you to the COVID-19 information page. On the COVID-19 page, you'll see the announcements that the MedDRA Management Committee had related to COVID-19. You also have a link, which makes it easier for users for the MedDRA version 23.0 update, as well as a link for the downloads page, so you don't have to go on separately to the downloads area of the website. And as well, you can access a recording and a presentation of an MSSO webinar we did earlier in April that was dedicated to MedDRA and COVID-19. And specifically, very helpful to find on this page is a link to the COVID-19 related terms spreadsheet. And we're going to go into that detail a little bit and show you what exactly is on that website. Okay, this is the sample of the COVID-19 spreadsheet, and if you look at it from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, the left side, column A, shows you the MedDRA numerical code of the term that was added, and the remaining columns, B through G, show you the entire MedDRA hierarchy of the term. Column H will show you the type of change this was. For example, if you can see for the first entry, it was a new HLT, coronavirus infections, and some terms, as you can see in column H, were new PTs, others were LLTs, and so forth. Column I is very important to notice. We have some terms flagged with a Y. This helps identify terms for a COVID-19 search strategy if you're pressed to produce one internally. Because we don't have a dedicated COVID-19 SMQ yet, we felt this would help users to flag terms and sort of use these terms for their internal COVID-19 search strategy. Of course, users can use to include or exclude the terms according to their needs. As well, you can look at the HLT coronavirus infections if you want for your search. So moving along to SMQs. Existing SMQs impacted by the new COVID-19 terms have not been updated in the April 23.0 update. Our medical team did a review and they feel primarily two SMQs may be impacted, and these two SMQs include SMQ infective pneumonia and SMQ opportunistic infections. Although COVID-19 is not a traditional opportunistic infection, but it can be more severe in the immunocompromised population. And some of the COVID-19 related terms could be added to this SMQ. So to recap, these two SMQ will be updated along with all of the other SMQs in production for the MedDRA version 23.1 release in September. Important to note is that the MedDRA Management Committee has approved the development of a dedicated SMQ for COVID-19 to go into production also by September 1st with the 23.1 release. And as we mentioned before, in the interim period, users can consider using the flag terms on the spreadsheet as a search strategy for COVID-19 search. Now we're going to update you on a little change we're having with the points to consider document. We're doing a little switch from our regular twice a year update to now once a year. This change was approved by the MedDRA Management Committee and the ICH. Therefore, starting with version 23.0 in March, the points to consider documents are only going to be updated once a year with every March release. The points to consider documents which will be affected are the MedDRA term selection document, as well as the MedDRA data retrieval and presentation document. One of the reasons for this change to the once a year update is that we found these documents are relatively stable with very few changes from each version to version release. Now this once a year update is also going to be more user friendly because we found that our user community usually coordinates their internal coding guideline updates with our schedule of the twice a year updates. And now that we're moving to once a year, this will become more user friendly. And now we have another poll question for the audience. And of course, if more than one answer is applicable, please choose all that apply. Which points to consider documents do you use in your organization? A, the term points to consider document, or B, the data retrieval and presentation document, or C, the companion document, or D, the condensed form of the points to consider document. So we'll give you a few seconds to answer. Please let us know which documents you use internally, and if, of course, more than one, you can choose more than one. This type of feedback is important for the MSSO because we like to see which things are relatively used more than the other with our user community.
I have closed the poll and the term selection PTC has 96%, data retrieval and presentation PTC has 36%, companion document 30%, and the condensed point PTC documents have 11%.
So the winner is choice A. Most of you in the user community use the term selection points to consider document. So thank you very much for that feedback. Thank you, Hannah. So now let's talk about the PTC companion document. This document has more detailed information, it has numerous more examples, and also has guidance on specific topics of regulatory importance. It's a document it's updated basically based on user needs, and currently we are in its first edition. The first edition covers data quality and medication errors. Now, based on user feedback, we are updating our medication error section, and this should be available by July 2020. And also based on user feedback, we are working on a new section on product quality. This section is going to expand on the topic of product quality and the potential effects on patients. We have drafted this and we have had discussions with the PTC working group in May, and the draft is still being worked on. The final release date for this is still to be determined. Now let's talk a bit about the translations of our points to consider documents. The full points to consider documents are going to be translated, of course, in English and Japanese, but as well in selected other languages in which there's great global expansion of the use of MedDRA. We've seen an increased use of MedDRA and expansion in 3 regions particularly, China, South Korea, as well as Latin America. Therefore, these points to consider documents, the full translation will also be in Chinese, Korean, and Spanish. These translations are going to be based on version 23.0 release of the documents. And as well, since we have a global expansion, we also have local support staff in these areas. They are native speakers, and this will help us perform the translations as well. The staff are conducting numerous trainings in these regions, and having a full translation in the corresponding languages is going to help support that training. We hope to complete these translations by October 2020. And on this slide, we have sort of summarized the release cycle updates for each of the points to consider documents and the languages they're available in. So if you can see, to summarize, the MedDRA term selection points to consider document, as we mentioned, is now only going to be updated annually with every March release of MedDRA. And the MedDRA term points to selection, the condensed version, will be updated as needed, but it will be translated into all MedDRA languages except those languages that have a full document translation. And similarly, for the points to consider data retrieval and presentation document, this is also only going to be updated annually from now on with the March release of MedDRA, and we started this with MedDRA version 23.0 in March. This will be available in the English, Japanese, and the 3 languages we spoke about, Chinese, Korean, and Spanish. And the corresponding condensed version of this document will be translated into all of the MedDRA languages except for those languages that have the full document translation. So this is a good chart to look up when each document will be updated and which languages it will be available in. Now, regarding the points to consider companion document, as we mentioned, this has more detailed information. It has numerous more examples, and it is updated as needed. It's composed of topics of importance based on user needs. And based on the user needs, we're working on the new product quality section, which is in draft form still. Now, moving on to our next topic. The MSSO has been working on the SNOMED CT MedDRA mapping project. This project was developed as an initiative of the IMI WebRadar 2 project, which stands for the Innovative Medicines Initiative Web Recognizing Adverse Drug Reactions. This mapping is based on frequently used MedDRA terms, and it consists of 2 independent bidirectional maps. These maps are intended to support interoperability between the 2 terminologies. So the first mapping is from MedDRA to SNOMED CT, and we have a strong potential use case for this. For example, we can facilitate this mapping to help MedDRA-coded regulatory data feeding into clinical decision support systems. Similarly, we can have the SNOMED CT to MedDRA map. This can facilitate SNOMED encoded electronic health record data to be converted to MedDRA for adverse event reporting or epidemiological research. Currently, we're undergoing an alpha test for these mappings. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you more detail of what the mapping looks like. These are exact conceptual maps. On the top, you can see the MedDRA to SNOMED CT map. We have the LLT numerical MedDRA code and the fully written out LLT name mapping to the closest concept in SNOMED with a SNOMED CT ID numerical number, as well as the written out name of the SNOMED CT fully specified name. And the bottom, you see an example of the SNOMED CT to MedDRA map. And this, of course, also goes with a numerical SNOMED CT ID, as well as a written out fully specified SNOMED name, mapping to the closest concept at LLT level with an LLT numerical code and the fully written out LLT name. Now, just to show you where we are as far as a timeline with this project, currently we are in the alpha test period phase, and we're engaging users from both terminologies, such as regulators, industry, electronic health record vendors, clinical users, to help us with this alpha testing. And the scope for this testing includes format and content. If your organization is interested in helping us with this testing, please feel free to reach out to the MSSO help desk with an email. But keep in mind, before you do that, that you meet 2 of our criteria to help with the testing. Number 1, make sure you have a strong use case. And 2, you already have access to SNOMED CT coded data. And then by September 2020, we feel this alpha test period should be completed. And by next year, April 2021, the production version of the maps will be ready. These will be available free of charge to licensed SNOMED and licensed MedDRA users. Now, both organizations, SNOMED International and ICH MSSO, will maintain the production maps. And this maintenance will include adjusting to changes in the terminologies, as well as supporting requests for changes to existing map terms and supporting requests for new terms to be mapped. Now let's move on to the MSSO MedDRA training that we did in 2020. As you know, the MSSO has a comprehensive suite of trainings and training formats. We currently offer face-to-face individual in-person trainings, as well as webinar format, and we also have a YouTube channel. In 2020, similar to other global organizations, we were impacted by various travel and in-person meeting restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we adapted and increased the number of our webinar trainings in order to meet users' training needs. As you can see depicted on the chart in graphical form below, in red, you can see that 59 of our face-to-face classes were canceled due to the pandemic. But the blue color bar shows that in order to meet that demand, we increased the number of webinars to help meet the needs. We are still closely monitoring the pandemic situation for our Q3 and Q4 trainings. So because we increased the number of webinars for the training, we enhanced the interactivity to make it interesting and more interactive with the audience. We increased the number of interactive polling questions, as well as increased the number of graphics in our trainings. There's a new format we tried in 2020. We had the first MSSO open session. This was conducted on May 7th. And this was basically a live interactive format in the form of a Q&A webinar. It allowed the MSSO staff and the registered MedDRA users to interact with one another live with questions and answers. It was received very well, and now we have another MSSO open session planned for the end of June. If you're interested to attend that, you can go on to the MedDRA.org website and register yourself. And I'd like to conclude my session with a brief talk on MedDRA IT tools, or MedDRA APIs, MedDRA Application Program Interfaces. The APIs were developed in response to requests from users, and these are basically simple building blocks using a cloud-based open software model. This allows users more flexibility and the ability to develop their own MedDRA tools. These can replicate functionality such as the functions that our MSSO browser performs, as well as the MedDRA version analysis tool. Since the API are based on already established MedDRA tools, they have been validated, and therefore when you use them, they're going to produce the same results, either to build or integrate into your own systems. The APIs are available now for evaluation by MedDRA users, and if you're interested, please send the MSSO help desk an email. And the official production set of these API will be ready in October 2020. Now, if your organization is interested in getting more API information, you can go to the MedDRA.org website, and from the top banner, How to Use, click on Tools. When you click on Tools, you'll come to the green gear mechanism, and from there, just click on APIs. That'll bring you to the MedDRA APIs page. And here you'll find very useful information. You'll find API documentation, frequently asked questions, as well as a link to a previously held API webinar, and you can listen at your leisure. There's also a direct link, which is on the slide, and these slides will be available after the presentation. Thank you very much. This concludes my part of the session. And now I'd like to hand over the floor to Dr. Sonia Brajovic from the FDA. She's with CEDAR Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and more specifically, the Office of Surveillance Epidemiology. So Sonia, you have the floor.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me okay? Can someone confirm I'm doing this correctly?
I can hear you.
Hello? Okay, excellent. And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. And I am still struggling here. There we go. Yeah, I mean, it is quite a different experience to sit alone in my room talking out loud from seeing everyone. I wish we had an in-person meeting, but thanks very much for the opportunity to have a meeting at all. So first, my colleagues asked me to start by thanking the MSSO for their hard work in incorporating all the new terms that we've been requesting recently with medication error review for the SMQ, as well as for the companion documents, so the regulators were reviewing and updating. And in that process, we came up with a lot of new terms that we needed, that were requested and incorporated either for this or the upcoming version, and we are very grateful for that. So my talk today is FAIR's update with the COVID-19 related examples and the disclaimer that I represent the views of myself and not necessarily of the FDA. And importantly, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Joe Wyeth from the Division of Medication Error Prevention and Analysis, and Manish Kalaria from the Regulatory Science staff. So my job, is with data standards. It is with data quality of cases, of individual case safety reports with appropriate MedDRA coding for adverse events and medication errors, and the dictionaries in general. Yet I will try to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has affected, our personal and professional lives as it relates to the reporting of individual case safety reports, and in particular the emergency use authorization and reporting to FAIRS. And then I'll highlight some medication error reports that we have received over the last few months. Okay. So yeah, I'm not an expert in this. This is all FDA public information, but I'm hopeful that it'll at least highlight some of these factors as they relate to our daily work. So what are some of the challenges that are contributing to adverse event and medication error reporting during the COVID-19 pandemic over the last few months? One is that products are used outside of the FDA-approved labeling. There are emergency use authorizations and unfamiliarity with them. There are many product availability issues, expanded use of telemedicine, and then self-treatment has increased. So what is emergency use authorization? Well, it is the authority that allows FDA to help strengthen the nation's public health protection against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear agent, as well as emerging infectious disease threats. And it's done by facilitating the availability of and use of medical countermeasures that include drugs, vaccines, and devices that are needed during this public health emergency. So I'm reading the exact text from the public page. But what's important is that this process is documented in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and there are a couple of steps that precede it. So first, the Secretary of the Health and Human Services needs to declare that there is a public health emergency, and then that circumstances exist to justify authorization, and then the FDA has the authority to actually issue the authorization for emergency use. And this is maybe for unapproved medical products or for unapproved uses of approved medical products that are used during the public health emergency. And then the guidance for industry has a section that specifies the monitoring and reporting of adverse events. So as conditions allow, monitoring and reporting of adverse events is required. And then for the unapproved uses, and then FDA would set within the EUA the conditions for, for unapproved uses would be, well, both are set within the emergency use authorization that is authorized. So the public page for the COVID-19 related emergency use authorizations, there is one for drug products, one for medical devices. There is an archive of prior ones that were issued for other public health emergencies. So you can see the ones that are active as of today. There is 3. It was just this Monday on June 15th that FDA revoked the emergency use authorization for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. And this was originally issued on March 28th. to be used to treat certain hospitalized patients with COVID-19. But then FDA has continuously reviewed the pre-existing and the new data and reanalyzed it and looked for literature and ongoing reports and FAERS cases and multiple data stream, the National Poison Center data, etc., and has concluded that based on new information and other information, it was no longer reasonable to believe that the oral formulations of these two drugs may be effective in treating COVID-19, nor that the potential benefit would outweigh the risk. And because of that, the EUA for emergency use of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine to treat COVID-19 has been revoked. And then you can see the letter of revocation. It has a memorandum that follows it that explains, highlights the data sources that informed the decision. So there is an EUA for Remdesivir, and this is from the healthcare provider fact sheet that specifies the authorized use and reporting requirements. So it's to be administered intravenously to treat a suspected or laboratory confirmed coronavirus disease for patients that are hospitalized with severe disease. And on 15th of June, there was an update to that healthcare provider fact sheet that now includes a newly discovered potential drug interaction due to co-administration of remdesivir with chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, where the combination reduces the antiviral activity or may reduce the antiviral activity of remdesivir. So there is a section within the EUA and the healthcare provider fact sheet for mandatory requirements for reporting. So the providers utilizing the product are responsible for mandatory reporting of all medication errors and adverse events, which are serious, that may be related to the drug within 7 calendar days from the onset of the event. These are to be submitted to the FDA MedWatch program. So they come to FAERS directly. And also the providers are requested to submit a copy to the manufacturer, to the sponsor. Okay, so next, that's some background of what cases we may be receiving now that we usually don't. And I'll then highlight some of these cases that we received over the last couple of months. So multiple data streams, again, of cases that come to FAERS. One of them is from ISMP. I'm highlighting the case from the ISMP website since it's there in full narrative. But it was a medication safety alert from the Institute for Safety Medication Practices of a case of a patient that was originally thought to have community-acquired pneumonia, treated with azithromycin and then ceftriaxone as well, admitted to the hospital, confirmed positive for COVID-19. The antibiotics were discontinued. She was started on hydroxychloroquine, this was going to be for 5 days. And then on that last day, she experienced ventricular fibrillation and coded. And well, they were able to resuscitate her and she has recovered. But the safety practice recommendation out of this is the patient suffered ventricular fibrillation and cardiac arrest due to QTc prolongation from the combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, even though she did not receive the two drugs on the same day. They were not received concomitantly. But there is a long half-life. So for azithromycin, up to 72 hours. Because they were given closely enough together, there was the accentuation of the QTc prolongation from both drugs. So this is a labeled interaction for hydroxychloroquine, not to be administered with other drugs that prolong QTc, and necessity to perform electrocardiogram monitoring for all patients who receive these medications in combination or close together. So this brings us to medication errors. This was a labeled drug-drug interaction, which is a type of a medication error. And medication errors are preventable events that may cause or lead to inappropriate medication use or patient harm while the medication is in the control of a healthcare provider, patient, or consumer. A medication error may or may not result in an adverse event. It's still a medication error. And the reporting of just medication errors is voluntary, highly recommended, but voluntary to FDA. On our side, DMEPA focuses on preventing use errors related to product names, labeling, packaging, and design. So here are some events of suspected wrong dose errors that we've seen recently. There were excessive doses, for example, chemotherapy dose that was more than should have been per the labeled instruction. And the contributing factor was that there were more telemedicine type visits and inability to document patient weight in this manner. So chemotherapy doses are based on patient weight, and they were based on patient weight prior to the start of the pandemic, and yet the weight decreased over the weeks, but this was not highlighted in a telemedicine visit. Another example is a wrong dose that was compounded. Contributing factor is that hydroxychloroquine was not available as an oral suspension. And this was a foreign report of a 14-year-old, so 45 kilos, under 50, who was admitted for COVID-19 and received hydroxychloroquine liquid solution that was compounded at a 10-fold greater dose than prescribed. There are reported events of wrong drug errors. So some are due to look-alike, sound-alike names. And this was another ISMP report of hydroxychloroquine oral suspension that was compounded instead of the intended hydrochlorothiazide due to similar name, and the error was caught in time. So this was coded as intercepted wrong drug product selected, and the contributing factor drug name lookalike is also stated in the narrative and thus coded. Another example, a patient was dispensed hydroxychloroquine sulfate instead of her prescribed hydrochlorothiazide and experienced an adverse event. So here we coded wrong drug dispensed, wrong drug administered, and the adverse event, coding what's stated in the narrative without inferring added information. The next case was interesting. It's a 15-year-old treated with hydroxychloroquine for lupus, so long-term prescription, but she presents with a dramatic personality change that progresses to acute psychosis. And then scrutiny of her home medication revealed that she has been taking chloroquine sulfate instead of the prescribed hydroxychloroquine. And the circumstances were that due to the pandemic, the family was experiencing financial issues and trying to save money. They went to a foreign mail order distribution company to procure their hydroxychloroquine and were not aware that what they actually received was chloroquine. So the doses of the two are not interchangeable, and chloroquine is more toxic. All right. Some other examples, there were many reports of missed doses or delayed therapy due to drug shortages, provider offices being closed, patients' fear of increased risk because their regular therapy has an immunomodulating effect, and then also patients who were scheduled to come into an office to receive their injection were delayed due to potential coronavirus exposure, so they were not allowed to come in. We saw some extra doses, so what is most likely an off-label reports associated with inhalation medicines that are recommended at maximum of 6 puffs daily were prescribed at greater 8 puffs daily usually. And then there were accidental overdoses. And the reports where a patient has mistakenly took an overdose of a drug and has an adverse event, but says that they don't want to go to emergency room or hospital because of their fear of exposure. Okay. There were some suspected errors reported with the emergency use authorization for Remdesivir, and contributing factor may be unfamiliarity with the product, unfamiliarity with the fact sheet, confusion with specific instructions for the two formulations. There is the lyophilized product versus the solution vial. And then there are specific instructions for children and others who weigh less than 40 kilograms. They're to use only the lyophilized powder. So some of the examples were that remdesivir was mixed in dextrose instead of the sodium chloride. Remdesivir solution was incorrectly mixed in 100 milliliters instead of the 250 milliliters recommended. And then there were product storage errors, either with the temperature or the duration, because it is somewhat specific. The powder can be stored at room temperature. The solution vials must be refrigerated. Solution vials can be at room temperature up to 12 hours prior to dilution in an IV bag, but once diluted, the IV bag can be at room temperature for 4 hours and refrigerated for 24, etc. Okay. So I'll highlight one case for the coding challenge. And this is a narrative where remdesivir in solution was incorrectly mixed in 100 milliliters of diluent instead of 250 due to misunderstanding of the drug info document. So an error occurred. The coding that we see is the drug dilution and inappropriate volume of solution, which is an LLT that exactly matches the described scenario. And this LLT rolls up to the PT product preparation issue. Okay. So when one follows the PT into the standardized MedDRA query for medication errors, it is an issue term, and thus it is in the broad scope. And that's how it is. The coding challenge is that the MedDRA terminology contains a specific preferred term for product preparation error and one for the product preparation issue. So this particular case documents an error. There was an incorrectly mixed drug in 100 milliliters of diluent instead of 250 milliliters. But the selected coding documented an issue. There isn't an exact scenario of the drug diluent in an appropriate volume of solution that rolls up to the error term. And one can't really expect every scenario to be reflected in MedDRA. There are many scenarios, and MedDRA is very granular. But what to do in such a situation? So what should one do? The coding approach then, if we go to the ICH MedDRA points to consider a companion document, it advises that if there is a specific error that's reported but not a suitable LLT, then, well, one can go through the change request process to request the term, and in the meantime, select the closest available term to code the reported error. So then what is the closest available term? Is it the one that goes to the product preparation issue? Is it just medication error? And no, definitely not. Do not select medication error when there is anything more specific. The use of the medication error term should be completely avoided unless there is nothing else reported about the medication error. It is such a general term that really does not help. So then the closest available term is product preparation error. It is important on our review side that we can easily distinguish a case reporting an error from a case that is not reporting an error. So the error cases have priority in review. The error terms are in the narrow scope of the standardized MedDRA query of medication errors. The issue terms that relate are in the broad scope. So one always prioritizes the error-specific terms and the narrow scope in the review, and then goes to the broad scope as well. And it's important then to distinguish, to identify a report of an error with an error MedDRA term. Okay, so that's the correct one. To highlight some other challenges that we've seen over the last couple of months, there were many drug shortages due to the pandemic. There were product supply issues, delays, chain interruptions, distribution and shipment delays, etc. And we have MedDRA terms for the supply issues and availability issues. this is an example of how this then manifests downstream. So this was an alert from the FDA to healthcare professionals to let them know that there is a temporary absence of the warning statement on the vial caps of two neuromuscular blocking agents that are rocuronium and vecuronium, and they used to have, well, they're supposed to have the paralyzing agent text on that vial to alert the user. So these were in short supply, and to continue making the drugs available, the vials did not contain this text that one is used to being alerted to, so as not to make a mistake in selecting the proper vial. Okay. So the drug shortages, FDA continuously works with the companies to address these as best as possible. There were shortages of both brand name and generic drugs due to increased demand and supply chain problems. Mostly the affected products were IV drugs used in intensive care, but also others. For example, there was a shortage of an antidepressant due to demanding soars in demand. Okay. There were reports of incorrect product storage due to social distancing. So, for example, people, rather than picking up their product, had it mailed in, and it would be delivered to the mailbox. The patient would not be aware that the package is sitting in the mailbox, or it would be left at the front door and sit in the sun for a few hours till the patient became aware that the mail was delivered. And then there were some issues with increased self-treatment and accidental exposures. So one communication that the FDA sent out was about the pediatric hand sanitizer exposure. Contributing factors is that with both kids and adults at home, kids were more unsupervised while adults worked. And although medications and all kinds of chemicals should be stored out of reach of children, sometimes they're not. So there were cases of accidental exposure to various products by child. And then also the sanitizers need to be kept out of reach of children because in case of ingestion, small amounts can be very toxic to young children and also pets. Okay. There were intentional misuses of disinfectants and antiseptics. People did so to try to prevent infection. But these uses were not appropriate, like washing food with bleach or using household cleaners of disinfectants on bare skin, even inhaling or ingesting these products. And there was a sharp increase in calls to the poison control centers for exposures to cleaners, disinfectants, antiseptics during the pandemic. Okay, so that's it. I tried to highlight some of the factors that really, although outside of our immediate areas of responsibility, do impact the kinds of cases that we are processing in terms of individual case safety reports for adverse events and medication errors. Thanks you for your attention, and that's the end.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Now I think we'll have a brief Q&A session just to see if there are any questions from the attendees thus far. And I think Hannah and Jane will help us navigate those.
Yes, okay. Our first question is, following COVID, changes were made very quickly, but not all changes submitted since December to April were included, only the COVID-related terms. Would the MSSO consider reducing the time from freeze date to release date for future versions based on their experience in releasing a quicker version for the 23.0 updated release? Would they consider less than 3 months interval between freeze and release?
I think that's a question that can best be fielded by Judy. If Judy can help us navigate that one.
Thank you. Yes, Amina. This is Judy Harrison, Chief Medical Officer of the MedDRA MSSO. The 23.0 update was a unique event in the history of MedDRA. Over 20 years, we'd never produced an extraordinary update like this to react to users' needs in the face of a pandemic. And we're currently conducting some lessons learned about, in the unfortunate event if something like this happens in future, how can we best respond to users' needs? There are a number of potential modifications that we could make in extraordinary circumstances to our normal biannual release schedule. We could look at, for example, at making the supplemental terms for terms related to an emerging pandemic available to users sooner rather than later. Certainly, users are able to access those supplemental terms in the MVAT tool and the web-based browser. The terms and their codes are available on an ongoing basis in English only. So users would be able to use those terms and codes internally for their coding purposes. The challenge comes, of course, with exchanging data with other partners such as CRO partners or regulatory agencies whose systems might not be set up to be able to accommodate those new terms that aren't tied to a particular traditional release. So rest assured, we are discussing with the user community. We may be coming out to throw around some ideas with you about potential flexibility in our release schedule, whether that's extending or condensing the time from a release to a freeze date, or increasing availability to supplemental terms. There are a number of approaches that we could take, so we will engage with you. Hopefully we won't have to rise to that challenge again, but it has caused us to think critically about our release process.
Thank you, Judy.
The next question is, will COVID-19 be removed from the opportunistic infections SMQ when the COVID SMQ is released?
No, it will still remain within the opportunistic infections SMQ because, as Samina has mentioned, it's not your traditional opportunistic infection, but it can be more severe and more frequent in the immunocompromised population. So if you're used to running that SMQ for a broad range of pathogens, the COVID-19 will still remain in there. We've also added related COVID-19 terms to the infective pneumonia SMQ. We have a PT for COVID-19 pneumonia. Also, we have a term for COVID-19 sepsis, so that has been added to the sepsis SMQ. And you will see the addition of all of those COVID-19 related terms in the existing SMQs in 23.1 in September. Samina has mentioned that we are working on a dedicated SMQ for COVID-19. Many of you might have been involved with providing some input for this SMQ. Again, it's not a traditional SMQ because of the urgency of getting a basic query out for users in the 23.1 timeframe. We don't have the ability to perform our existing protocol, which is to test the SMQ on databases. It certainly has a variety of different use cases. Rather than necessarily identifying potential cases of COVID-19, it might be used more for broader aspects, for counting the number of COVID-19 terms, counting the number of positive and negative test results, for example. So based on input from regulatory and industry experts, we have developed preliminary documentation and a term list that we will be reviewing further with the MedDRA Management Committee, and hopefully we will be able to go into production in 23.1. So it's really an expansion of the existing query of very specific COVID-19 terms that Samina showed you in that initial spreadsheet, and certainly can be customized by users according to your particular needs, perhaps in using it in combination with other SMQs that we have for taste and smell disorders, embolic and thrombotic events, and so on. So it's a very focused SMQ. We certainly will expect, as time goes on, we'll add additional relevant terms to the SMQ, and we'll look at its performance in databases. We'll be grateful for your feedback on the SMQ. So it will continue to evolve over time. So I hope that's some useful information for you on that.
The next question we have is, MedDRA has many terms where the organism/infection and the location are combined. There are proposals for new COVID-19 terms that are not being approved, yet the terminology supports other disease states. Can you provide the rationale for why we are limiting the COVID-19 combination terms? Drug safety is concerned with the amount of noise that will be created in surveillance without having the most specific MedDRA codes.
Samina, maybe you could address that because you're part of our international medical officer team and you're on the front line for the change requests.
Absolutely. Well, this is sort of hard to answer with a particular term, example, but overall I can say the medical review team or the group of international medical officers, we typically provide the rationale for a rejection for each term. So the situation and the reasoning of the rejection is unique for each term that's submitted. And we can certainly take that offline if there's a particular term that the question the attendee has. So we can certainly address this question offline with the individual. We can move on to the next question.
Wonderful. Our next question is, will there be any guidance for COVID-19 scenarios such as acute respiratory distress syndrome due to COVID-19? Would that be appropriately captured as LLT SARS-CoV-2 acute respiratory disease, or would MedDRA recommend splitting these terms out?
Judy, do you want to take that one?
Yes, would you mind just repeating the question again?
It's quite a long one.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
The question is, will there be any guidance for COVID-19 scenarios such as acute respiratory distress syndrome due to COVID-19? Would that be appropriately captured as LLT SARS-CoV-2 acute respiratory disease, or would MedDRA recommend splitting these terms out?
Yeah, I believe they're separate at the moment. We're generally advising split coding. So you would have the COVID-19 representing the infection, and then any clinical manifestations would be coded separately. So you would code ARDS separately. We have some combination terms, like the primary clinical manifestation is COVID-19 pneumonia. That's a combination term. But as we see the emerging picture of this infection, it's extremely diverse and multisystemic. So it really is very challenging to be able to make those definite associations. They appear to be clinically associated, but they might be downstream effects. We see acute renal failure, we see cardiac issues, we see hepatic issues, embolic and thrombotic events issues with COVID-19. So generally speaking, we're taking a conservative approach until these are well-established etiologies. We're not tending to put in combination terms. So in the interim, people can choose to code those two separately. So I hope that answers your question.
And we have a question that is kind of related to what you just spoke about, and that is asking, will COVID-19 clotting related issues be added?
Again, I think until we know more about the specific etiology, pathogenesis of the clotting abnormalities that we see, the best approach would be to code the COVID-19 and then terms such as hypercoagulation or DIC, or the sequelae of those. For example, we're seeing heart attacks and strokes, so you would code those sequelae separately.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I totally agree with Judy that the medical review team is taking a very conservative approach because the situation for this particular disease is still evolving and more details of the pathogenesis and so forth are still evolving. So it's still early, therefore our conservative approach.
Our next...
And I think we'll take one more question.
One more question. Will the PTC companion document coming in July 2020 contain examples of drug device malfunction events?
Yes, we have extensively revised the medication errors section of the PTC companion document based on user input, and there's a lot of interest there about device malfunction events leading to patient consequences, an expanded section on missed doses, which include missed doses in error and intentional missed doses as a result of various device malfunctions and misprogrammings. So I think you'll find a lot of granularity there to help you in your coding, particularly in relation to devices.
Okay, so that concludes this first Q&A session. Now we're going to move along to the last session of the day, which is an interactive coding exercises session. And this is going to be conducted by my MSSO colleague, Dr. Amanda Saunders. Amanda, the floor is yours for the quiz.
Great. So just to introduce myself to the group, my name is Amanda Saunders, and I am a medical officer with the MSSO based in Raleigh, North Carolina. So thank you all for joining us today. I will just rephrase a little bit, Samina. So we will look at this as coding questions for discussion and not a quiz, because I don't want you to feel like you are under pressure for performance here. We are going to use the new polling software that Samina mentioned in her introductory slides, and that software package is called Poll Everywhere. So the way that you can access the polling software is actually to go to the website www.pollev.com, and you will be prompted for the name of the session, and that session is A. Saunders MSSO. And when you join, you will be able to respond to activities that we will present on the screen. So I hope that you'll take a moment to open up a browser, either on your computer or on your smartphone, and go to that website, pollev.com, and enter the session name of A. Saunders MSSO. Now, there are over 200 connections on the call today. So what I'm going to do is actually show an example of an activity we'd like you to respond to, which should appear on your screen if you have successfully logged in. But this will hopefully give those of you who need to jump over and open the software an opportunity to do so. The polling is done anonymously, so there's no need to capture information regarding your individual username or anything like that, and we will not be tracking these responses. Great. Fantastic. It looks like there are quite a few of you who have been able to get into the polling. And I am just monitoring on a separate screen how many have responses we've received, just to get an idea of making sure that you're able to log in. So this is great. As I mentioned, we have over 200 connections on the call today, and I think it's always nice to see where our colleagues are joining us from. You can see that we truly are a global audience, despite being the U.S. user group. And this virtual format has enabled us to have so many colleagues joining us from all over the globe, and we're very happy to be able to accommodate so many. That's great. So we're up to about 100 responses now. So I'm going to take that as an indication that, well, somebody's calling us from Antarctica, so welcome. Oh, okay, good. No, that was a mistake. All right, so you can see that you are able to change your answers and then replace your response with the answer that you'd like to give. So thank you very much for your participation in this, and hopefully that you'll find this to be a useful session. So Ms. Jane Knight and Samina Qureshi are also going to help me as we go through these questions I would like for you to continue to answer or continue to add questions to the Q&A panel in your GoToWebinar interface as questions arise, so that we are able to have conversation around any issues that arise with these coding questions as time permits. All right, so I'm gonna move on to the first question. And we've got a few folks out in the middle of the ocean there. All right, here we go. So this is our first narrative question that we are posing to you. So the information is presented at the top of the screen, and we would like for you to select the response that you feel most accurately reflects the coding situation. So Joe came in for a routine checkup and told the doctor he lived with his parents. They were both ill due to COVID-19. So you should be able to see the question now on your screen, and you are able to respond to the question as you feel fit. And again, I am watching on a separate screen to see how many responses we've received, just to give as many of you an opportunity to respond as you'd like. Well, that's great. So you guys are much more comfortable with coding questions than you are with where you're located today. So that's very good. We've got well over 120 responses now, so that's fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the correct answer here. I'm not going to lock the responses, but the correct answer to this coding narrative, if you will, we would suggest is exposure to COVID-19, because the patient who has come in for his checkup is not reporting symptoms or illness of COVID-19, but instead just reporting an exposure to the illness. All right, great. So let's have a look at the next question. Again, you should be able to respond. Although the patient's COVID-19 test was positive, the physician said that the patient had no symptoms. So a little more uncertainty about this. Still getting quite a few. All right. So at this point, I'm going to reveal the correct answer. And as you can see, the best response for coding this particular scenario is asymptomatic COVID-19. And as many of you know and are familiar with the term selection points to consider document, when a diagnostic code can encompass relevant laboratory or diagnostic testing findings, and the two are consistent with one another, the recommendation is that you would code only the diagnostic part of the narrative. So in this situation, the physician is effectively diagnosing the patient as asymptomatic COVID-19, and a COVID-19 test positive would certainly be consistent with that diagnosis. So the recommendation would be to simply code asymptomatic COVID-19. Now, again, this is the preferred option, and for those of you who are familiar with the points to consider document, specifically the term selection points to consider document, there are often alternates provided. So your company may choose to follow the alternate approach. However, the preferred option would be to code simply the diagnostic code. Great. Let's have a look at another. So in this particular narrative, the nurse administered the COVID-19 PCR test to the patient and it was positive. Great. So I'm Just watching our responses coming in. All right. So I'm going to show the correct answer here. And I think consistent with what most of you have already identified, there is an LLT that exists that is extremely specific for this PCR test, and therefore the recommended LLT would reflect the closest match to the verbatim text, which is the COVID-19 PCR test positive. And we didn't really get anything past you guys on that one. So let's go on to the next example. The patient was admitted for COVID-19 and now had progressed to pneumonia. And I guess we should say using the most current version of MedDRA, which is the correct answer. And I think this speaks to the earlier question regarding combination terms that Dr. Harrison provided a bit of additional explanation around, and that is that the COVID-19 pneumonia term has been added to MedDRA as a well-established clinical scenario setting up that primary site of manifestation for COVID-19. So this is a term that actually was added as a combination term in MedDRA, and therefore you have the ability to select a single term to represent COVID-19 and pneumonia. Great. And just to show you the correct response, but you have identified it now. There are a few responses down here in the coronavirus pneumonia. This would be a less specific option, and so the recommendation would be to choose the COVID-19 pneumonia. All right, so now let's look at a little bit different. The nurse inhaled the drug by mistake while mixing the ingredients of formulation for the patient. So a little bit of uncertainty around this question. Jane, any thoughts on what we're seeing with regard to the responses for this particular question?
Well, it looks like most people are there with us, the key things that's important. But with any of these type terms, the key things that I would look for would be, do we know the intention? Was it an error? First of all, the word accidental, that it was an error. Then when we look at the exposures and we go to the medication errors, what we see there is the key word is that it's preparing the drug. So you'll see when you go with the hierarchy will show split it, as we know it splits into preparation errors, administration errors and other types of errors. There's all storage or prescribing or dispensing, etc. So there we would be looking for an error, and here with it being an exposure, it's an accidental exposure, it's during preparation, so the inhalation while mixing. So that's the key things I'd be looking for. I'd be wanting to capture the fact it's preparing and capture the fact it's accidental. The exposure.
Excellent, thank you. And I think it, since I did not lock the responses there, I think most people shifted their responses to the accidental exposure while preparing drug for administration. And I think you would agree that that's the correct answer?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so Sarah didn't realize it was Saturday and forgot to take the weekly dose of her medication. Perfect. Great. So, Samina, in the interest of time, would you be willing to kind of give us your thoughts on this question and the coding for it?
Certainly. When you look at this example, the verbatim is trying to direct you and let you know that the subject forgot to take the weekly dose. From among the coding choice answers we see, some terms have the word issue in them, another choice has intentional, and the third choice has error. So we know from the verbatim that it's trying to relay that she forgot or it was in error that she missed her weekly dose. Therefore, the majority of the people have chosen the correct answer, which is drug dose in error.
Great.
We would have chosen the first one if we weren't quite certain of the intention or if it was an error. But since we know it was in error that she forgot, that's the correct choice.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so Sarah again, who missed her dose, but now she's reporting that she does not like the lemon taste of the new enteric-coated version of the tablet. But her friend Julie, who is also taking the medication, doesn't mind the new flavor. Great. So Jane, what do you think about the responses we're receiving on this one?
Well, I think the thing here is it that there's a problem with the taste, or is it just that the taste is changed and that this lady doesn't like the new flavour? And I think because the way it's worded, the Julie did not mind the new flavour, but Sarah did not like the lemon taste. So that's why there's nothing wrong with their sense of taste. So we're not going for the dysphagia taste. The peculiar taste of the product. Well, if we looked at the hierarchy for that one, that is that there's a problem with the product that's got a peculiar taste. So it's not that it's a defect in any way with the product itself. It's just that this particular lady doesn't like it. It's not an abnormal taste. So it is, as most of our attendees have said there, it is that she just dislikes the product. Dislike of product taste.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think this probably highlights for us that oftentimes we forget that MedDRA is used to not only code adverse event data, but can also be used to code various other aspects of information being reported to us regarding the use of medicinal products and devices. So great example here of not an adverse event, but instead a patient-reported complaint. All right. In this example, the verbatim text is the patient's lung cancer had spread to her bones. What would be the most appropriate choices here, or choice? Great. So I think where we're leveling off here is a good spot to kind of speak a little bit about the different choices here. So I think something that often comes up when we discuss coding these metastatic or metastases terms is the understanding the difference between a metastasis to and a metastatic from. So in this particular situation, we know the patient had lung cancer and it had spread. So therefore, it is a metastatic lung cancer. We also know the site of the spread to be the bones, and therefore we know that she has metastases from her lung cancer in her bones, or in the patient's bones. So the correct response of lung cancer metastatic along with bone metastases captures the complete picture of the information being presented here. And I think that metastatic and metastases can often trip up coders. So it's important to acknowledge and notice that difference in those terms. In MedDRA, when you see a metastases term, like the first term, bone metastases, that's representing the site of the metastatic spread. However, when you see the term lung cancer metastatic or metastatic disease, you are looking at the primary site of the disease and the fact that it is a stage of metastatic disease. So that one can also probably be a little tricky for autoencoders. So that's another point here, in that, you know, sometimes we have to be cautious of autoencoders and its ability to pull out information to ensure that we are accurately reflecting the information being captured, as well as capturing all of the specifics that the reporter is giving us. So we have about 10 minutes left in our 1.5-hour session, and I would like to just make sure that we have the opportunity to address any other questions that have come in. Hannah and Jane, do we have any other questions that we need to address?
No, not really. Let me see. There's just one arrived here. Let me just pass this one through. It's just arrived.
Okay, the one that has just arrived is that since the MSSO PTC states that for indications that describe a genetic marker or abnormality associated with a medical condition, select a term for both the medical condition and the genetic marker or abnormality. How should this principle be applied in light of the newly added breast cancer LLTs and PT terms? Example, non-small lung cancer. Oh, go ahead, Amanda.
No, go ahead, Hannah. That's what I was going to say. It's kind of hard when we don't quite know the term that they're referring to, but yeah, that's great.
The example they have provided is non-small lung cancer with KRAS mutation. Select LLT's non-small cell lung cancer and KRAS gene mutation.
So, Samina, are you able to address that on newly added breast cancer terms?
I'm not really clear on what the question is, but I would recommend to go ahead and follow what the PTC has written, that take the genetic marker term, the closest genetic marker term, as well as the disease state or the medical condition. So for breast cancer terms, if there is a available gene marker in the information, you would code that as well as the medical condition of breast cancer.
Absolutely, agreed. And then I think also if the combination term is available to represent the particular thing you're looking at, for example, triple negative breast cancer actually has an LLT, you could actually select that combined term to represent. However, if the specific genetic marker is not available in combination with the specific cancer type that you're looking at, then it would be best to continue to code those terms separately. Does anyone else on the panel have anything that they'd like to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Amanda. This is Judy and Samina. You've absolutely characterized that correctly. I think the challenge that we're facing is that we are receiving change requests for those combination terms. I can cite 2 recent examples. We've got PT HER2 positive breast cancer, HER2 positive gastric cancer. The combinations are endless. So we recognize this as a challenge. Do we continue to add individual terms that people would have to code in combination, or do we add the specific combination terms, and where does that end? And at what level in the terminology do we place them? Do we place them as LLTs or PTs? We recognize this as a challenge in the future, so we're planning within the next couple of months to convene an expert panel of regulators and industry representatives to be able to help us make some of these decisions, because we see this challenge being an ongoing one, as increasingly we get more information about genetic markers in combination with specific tumor types. So we hope to be able to formulate our own ideas with your help over the future and come up with some specific guidance that maybe we will then roll over into the term selection PTC that reflected an earlier time when we had less granularity, and now we might have to address that in a different way. So watch this space on that. That's a great question, so thank you for bringing that up.
Perfect. Thank you, Judy. We have been getting a little bit of conversation around the asymptomatic COVID example. So I just would like to go back and just kind of discuss that point if we could. I won't change the slides because I think everybody can remember the example. The question is why you wouldn't be coding that to a false positive test result. And I think, in fact, it's something to think about with regard to a basic MedDRA principle, which is coding information that's provided to us. And in the particular scenario, it wasn't indicated that it was a false positive test. And by the verbatim text, the physician himself or herself is actually reporting the information, and therefore the physician is indicating that it is an asymptomatic positive test, and we all know that that is an actual situation that can present itself with this particular infection. So it's just important to remember the basic concepts with MedDRA coding as well, which is that, you know, we don't want to introduce information into a report that wasn't given to us by the reporter. So the best approach would be to code based on that narrative, the asymptomatic COVID-19. Now, that's not to say that you as an organization might not want to provide additional follow-up questions to the physician and get additional information or further clarification regarding the false positive or whether or not the physician feels that the patient truly had a COVID-19 infection. But again, speaking to the principle of coding the information provided to us in the verbatim, the best choice would be that asymptomatic COVID-19 term. All right, so let's take another example. Unless, Hannah, have we gotten other questions?
We have a question about suspected COVID-19, as it is the only PT for a suspected infection. Please will you clarify why this disease has a specific suspected PT while others need to be handled using the guidance in section 3.1 of MTS PTC? How would you go about coding suspected coronavirus?
Sure.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Yes, I'd be happy to address this one. COVID-19 is just unique. We break all the MedDRA rules for it. You're quite correct in that when we're talking about typical diagnoses, provisional diagnoses in the term selection points to consider document, we say treat it as if it's the real thing. I think there's an example of possible myocardial infarction, or other words might be suspected, probable, rule out. It wouldn't be possible in MedDRA to have every disease with the qualifier of suspected. So the guidance in general cases is just treat it as if it's the real thing, because you have a high suspicion that that patient does have that condition. You can always change the coding if you get further information and the patient didn't have a myocardial infarction, for example. But in the case of COVID-19, in many cases, you do suspect the diagnosis. You have some symptoms, but because of lack of availability of testing, you can't confirm that diagnosis. So it is useful in this circumstance to have the specific PT for suspected COVID-19, just for us to enable to track the pandemic in the absence of confirmatory testing. So it is a little bit of an exception to the rule. And you will find just a handful of PTs in MedDRA that are exceptions to the rule. In fact, one that we call out specifically in the points to consider document is that case of suspected transmission of an infectious agent via product, because this is potentially a very serious quality issue and potentially a serious safety issue. So we actually do have a term for the suspicion of a transmission. We've other PTs, such as suspected product quality issue, suspected product tampering. These things can't always be confirmed. So it is a little bit of an exception to the rule.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that explanation, and thank you for the question. I'm just looking through to make sure that we don't have any additional questions right now, since we are 1 minute to time. Maybe we'll end it there because there could be additional. I'm sure we could go on forever for those of you who enjoy doing these coding questions and those of us who like discussing them. But in the interest of time, I will make sure that we have ample opportunity to thank you for your participation in this user group today and for your great questions and all your follow-up. I do want to take this opportunity to remind you again about our MSSO open session coming on June 30th. And you have the opportunity at this stage to continue to submit your questions to us, and we would encourage you to do that in advance so that we can ensure to have the most appropriate panel members available to you for that discussion and register to attend if you would like to join that session on June 30th. For those of the other panelists on the line, any closing remarks?
No, we'd just like to thank everyone for attending today and sharing their Thursday morning with us. And we hope to see more of them in the open session on June 30th. Thank you very much, everyone.